Well, remember that NATO was our invention in 1945 to 8. It was supposedly to save the poor Western European countries from the Russians are coming. Well, the Russians were not going anywhere, and we knew it. It was for us to keep military control through military bases over France, Germany, Italy, wherever, whatever. And then we had the CIA, which was there for not only disinformation, but to overthrow governments. I was in Italy in April of 1948, when it looked as if the communists might well have won the election, or certainly would have got enough votes to participate in the government. That was the CIA's first great victory. It was in 48. They spent so much money to make sure they bought newspapers, they bought politicians, that the communists could not play any part in the government. Now, I must say, an Italian communist in those days was not quite to the right of Jesse Helms, but they were very conservative people. Had they been in government, a lot of the turmoil in Italy would never have taken place over the last 50 years, and a lot of the corruption. We saw to it that they couldn't take part in a government when the people wanted them to. This is our task, to deny people any sort of government that they might want to choose. I was also in Guatemala in the late 40s, when United Fruit was suddenly, for the first time, taxed by the government, very small tax, because the government had no revenues. What happens? Henry Cabot Lodge gets up in the Senate and said, the government of Guatemala is communist and it is seizing United Fruit property. Well, he neglected to tell the Senate that he was on the board of directors of United Fruit, and the president of the country, Arbenz, was a socialist who had modeled himself on Franklin Roosevelt. Now, that may be objectionable to some people, but it was a freely elected and happy country, and it was civilizing itself. We sent the CIA in, they overthrew him, he had to flee the country, they seized the palace, they put in one general after another, and there's been a series of bloodbaths ever since, thanks to our intervention. You bring up Yugoslavia, wherever we set now, we are always on the side of reaction, counter to the people, but on the side of maximum corporate profits, as we will discover when the famous examination of Enron's papers does not come to light in Congress.
San Diego, California, you're next.
Hi, Mr. Vidal. Good morning. First of all, I just wanted to say that I loved you in Gattaca. You should do more movies. Anyway, I wanted to commend you for being courageous enough to voice your opinions and criticisms of, say, George Bush, because many people in the government and elsewhere are going to feel that's unpatriotic of you. And I'm just wondering if you foresee, in terms of your talking about losing our Bill of Rights, if you foresee this sort of, it almost being, illegal to be unpatriotic, like this day is going to come around that the next time Gore Vidal gets on TV and says George Bush doesn't know what Axis means, Vidal's going to get arrested or something like that. I mean, it seems like we're heading that way where a lot of things that you're saying is what I feel a lot of people feel, but it seems like a lot of people, and me as a writer too, are kind of afraid to express that, without getting that backlash.
Well, I don't think you should be afraid. I think go ahead and do it. If they want to take some sort of vengeance on you. The French have a wonderful phrase. I have to give it in French, and I'll try it. It's la politique du pire. It means the politics of the worst. If you have Bush, who is a nullity, controlled by great corporations, against my cousin Albert Gore, who didn't seem to be very much to a lot of people, you go for Bush because he's the worst. Because he will do so many stupid things that he will bring on the revolution faster. Now, this is the ultimate in French cynicism. And the person earlier who asked about Le Pen in France, that may be, well, what the French are up to. Let's just push this whole corrupt thing over and help the worst guy, who is a fascist called Le Pen. It may well be that having somebody, if I change, I just think about a change of the Constitution. We should have, if I don't like amendments, but if we do amend it, we should have the power of recall. If we get a government that is incompetent, a government that is going to bankrupt us, a government that has declared war on practically every country on earth, is putting all of our money into war, we should have the right to recall that government, to hold an election and kick them out. That is my constitutional thought for the day.
Now, Mr. Vidal, in your book, here's a quote from it, because you were talking about President Bush. You say, one cannot entirely blame the current Oval Office for incoherence. Though his predecessors have generally had rather higher IQs than his, they too assiduously served the 1% that owns the country while allowing everyone else to drift. Particularly culpable, President Bill Clinton. Although the most able chief executive since FDR, Clinton, in his frantic pursuit of election victories, set in place the trigger for a police state that his successor is now happily squeezing.
Well, I agree.
What you're saying is that it's not just President Bush?
It's not just Bush, of course not. He happens to be the patsy at the moment. Mark my words, he's going to be probably the most unpopular president in history. And this is where our poisonous media absolutely distorts everything. He's not popular. They say, oh, the polls. They say, look, we were attacked by monsters, Islamic monsters, and they killed innocent Americans. Don't you just hate that? And of course I hate it, you hate it, everybody hates it. George Bush has gone after them in their hideout in Afghanistan. It's probably not their hideout. Their hideout is Saudi Arabia, but anyway. Do you think he's doing a good job? He's leveled every city there, and we've got a government that's friendly to us, which we don't, but we say we have. And they say, yeah, he's doing a great job. So even somebody like Daschle, who should know better in the Senate, backed off when he started to say they ought to start explaining to the Senate what they're doing, what the plan is. After Afghanistan, it is clear they want to go into Iraq or Iran. This is constant war. We're not designed for that. Or we have to redesign ourselves into an imperial power. No republic can keep fighting everybody on something called terrorism, and we don't even know what it is until the president defines it. So-and-so is a terrorist country or potentially terrorist, or they may have enough talcum powder in order to build anthrax or whatever. This is no way to run a country, and we are now trapped in a war machine. When Mr. Rumsfeld gets up there, and he's a first-rate stand-up comic, I will grant him that, sitting there with these dumbhead journalists, and some not so dumbhead, but they can't ask anything, and makes fun of them, and there's a war going on, and they're not allowed to look at it. Part of my time in Europe is reading the papers. I can find out about what's happening in these wars that we fight, and you certainly can't find out about it in the New York Times, because they're going to follow the party line. So we are launched into perpetual war for perpetual peace, if I may repeat my title.
Wilmington, North Carolina. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think contrary to the instincts of the American people. A couple of people on the program have said, you know, they felt depressed and isolated. You're not depressed and isolated. The whole country agrees with you. It doesn't show up in the polls because the way the questions are asked, you get the answer you want. Oh yeah, he's popular. He's not popular. He's regarded as incoherent. You know, the American people are quite shrewd. They may not get around to voting very often, but they can certainly tell a dummy, and they can certainly tell somebody who is being paid off by big business. We're rather shrewd about that, and we have been all our history. Unfortunately, we used to have quite a few Mark Twains around to tell the people things, and now what Mark Twain you get can hardly get into the press, much less on television. So, thank you, C-SPAN.
Wilmington, North Carolina, you're next.
Yes, Mr. Vidal, I'm so glad you took that brief digression into the Twains of our American world, because if I could, I'd like to digress just briefly and ask you a question about Paul Bowles.
Okay.
It seems in the introduction to his collected stories, you applaud him for being one of the greatest American short story writers of that time, and is writing some of the most apt and observant stories for an American living abroad. it seems like that particular voice has just disappeared from our culture. And it seems like at a time right now we need that voice again to be outside of America, telling us, being that very accurate thinking eye, giving us back those very strange, ephemeral, haunting sort of nuances of Americans living abroad that Paul Bowles gave over to us. Is there someone writing right now in our American voice that's giving this over to us?
I don't think Paul's voice, well, it was an American voice, but the mind was pretty French by the time he died. And he comes more out of French literature than he does. I also said in my preface that he writes as though Moby Dick had never been written. I mean, he just ignores the American canon, and he is out of French literature. He has a bleakness, it's a worldview that he's got, which is reminding us the universe is not our friend. All of our religions, and God knows politics, are out there trying to say, you know, Jesus wants you for a sunbeam. Jesus loves you. Just give a little bit more money to the church, and he'll really love you. Bowles saw through all of that. He saw that the universe is, we're a part of it, but that's about the best we'll ever be. And it does not have our interests at heart. And we are alone, which means that we have to have, when we have at the moment a disastrous political system in the United States, all we have is what we have, is to correct it. People should be thinking about that and not worrying about bringing freedom and democracy to Kuwait. Kuwait is none of our business, and if we don't have freedom and democracy in our own country, why worry about others? In other words, the old Voltaire line, is cultivate your own garden, is the greatest truth probably said in Western Europe in the last 1,000 years. Only through that can you do something about your own society. Whenever a politician starts talking to you about we've got to do nation building and freedom and democracy, all the stuff that Bush has been reading off the teleprompter with a sense of real discovery, because with each word he's got a new word to cope with and a new concept. It is to make our own life in what is a hostile, or worse, indifferent universe. That seems to me quite enough work for any individual and certainly for any country.
What's your next project after talking more about this book?
Well, I've got 2 plays that were done years ago. 3, actually. One was done last winter in New York with some success, called The Best Man. I've now brought up to date Visit to a Small Planet. Same themes. That was done in 1957. I brought it up to date. I put George W. Bush in it as a character, too. I'm aiming for enormous popularity. And then a Civil War play. As far as I know, the Civil War, which was to us what the Trojan War was for the Greeks, there's never been a play in the 20th century that I know of set in the Civil War. And I think I've done my best to fill the hole. So theater is what I'm doing next.
In about an hour, we're going to start talking more about American presidents. Do you have a favorite?
John Quincy Adams.
Why?
John Quincy Adams gave a speech on the 4th of July, 1824. Now, I'm not very good at memorizing, but I can paraphrase it. The United States had been asked to help the Greeks liberate themselves from the Turks. And all of Europe was sentimental, romantic about the Greek culture. We've got to help these poor people. He said, the United States, this is the former President Adams, is not a paladin who goes forth to slay dragons in other lands. Yes, we could do so, and we could become dictatress of the world, but in the process, we would lose our soul. They don't make them like that anymore.
San Diego, you're next for Gore Vidal.
Yes, Mr. Vidal, you know, you were quite interesting, and when you were doing fictionalized history, you were readable and interesting and entertaining. I find you quite repulsive when you're doing fictionalized journalism. You know, your worldview, again, is very clever, but it's repulsive. It's very anti-American, and I find you rather disgusting.
Well, I find you pretty disgusting, too, because you don't seem able to read clearly. Your mind is full of things that perhaps Jerry Falwell or some other great thinker has put into it. Why don't you look around you? Why don't you see what kind of country you live in? Are you happy at the billions of dollars that are spent buying elections? Do you think this is a good America? Do you think this is an America John Quincy Adams would like when we go to every corner of the globe to bomb innocent people, by and large, as we've just done in Afghanistan? I don't think anybody who thinks that has an American corpuscle in his body. Thank you.
Mountain Home, Arkansas.
Well, thank you very much. Those of us on the, in some respects, the opposite end of the political spectrum may agree with you more than we think. You mentioned the possibility or even likelihood of a future Great Depression bringing about dramatic political change. I happen to agree with that, but my concern is the current political establishment may declare martial law, which will be very difficult to get rid of, and I wondered if you would respond to that.
Well, we go back to the French politics of the worst. You can't stop it, and I see it coming, as I suspect you see it coming, that there will be some form of martial law. We're already going to have, I have to carry my passport in my pocket now, in my own country. We're going to have identification. The Social Security number has been used as a means of, identification for the Treasury Department. They will have at the Treasury all of your income and outgo. They said in 5 years they should have it. Everything that you have done on plastic and so forth. It's going to be complete order imposed upon us by a federal machine that is quite scary. And nobody is making a warning sound about it. Most people, when they think about it, don't like it. But I was in a movie called Bob Roberts, which we improvised a lot, Tim Robbins and I play a worthy, ineffectual liberal senator, and he's a sort of homegrown fascist. And somebody's asking me at the end of it why I was defeated and so on, and why the liberals never did anything, and allowed the country to fall into the hands of a fascist. And I found I was improvising the dialogues, and I said, well, you know about the frog? If you take a frog and you put him in a bowl of, in a pan of boiling water, he'll die quickly and horribly and in great agony. If you put that frog in a pan of cool water, you put it on the stove, turn the heat on gradually, he's cooked and he's dead, and he didn't feel a thing for about an hour. I said, that's what happened. That's how we got where we are.
This is Gore Vidal's book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, How We Got to Be So Hated. Who's the publisher?
It's Avalon Books, which is associated with The Nation, which is a liberal, ineffectual magazine for which I write proudly.
Mr. Vidal, thank you very much for taking some time out of your time at the LA Festival of Books to come and join us and take some calls from our viewers.
Thank you.
We're going to go back inside Moore Hall now for our next panel, which